Welcome to part 2 of my series of Michael attempts to build a PC. So today I'm going to actually start building it, and before I do that I'm going to have to call my friend and find out where I actually begin.
Now, since I had no idea where to begin, I had to call my friend Sangran of Daily Setup Tech on Instagram. I'm gonna go on record and say that he was very patient with me trying to help build this thing through a tiny camera. So the least I could do is encourage you guys to check out his page, which will be linked down in the description below. So the first thing we have to do is open up this motherboard, and Sangran instructed me to just take everything out and place the motherboard itself on top of its own box, just to ensure that nothing gets lost or confusing. Next is to install the memory sticks. The process itself is pretty straightforward. You just have to make sure that everything lines up and you open up the tabs that would hold the memory sticks in place. It should go in fairly easily with a click. That's one memory down, and the next one for a total of 32 gigs. I put the motherboard aside so we can open up the CPU. Now this box looks big, but in all actuality, this is all that I'm going to be using because this big square thing right here is the cooler that comes with it. But for this build, we're using something else. There's a small arrow that's on the motherboard and the CPU that should tell you how this should be oriented. I should also stress that this is probably the most delicate process, so be careful. Next is the solid state drive, but before that I need to remove this cover. With the cover off, it's fairly easy to install the solid state drive. You just have to make sure that the pins line up, and that's pretty much it. Before putting the cover back, I had to install this thermal patch on the cover itself so that when it makes contact with the solid state drive, it helps dissipate the heat. Next is to prepare the case provided by Sliger. First was take off all the panels and then install the I/O shield. I should note that because of the way my motherboard is oriented, this needed to be upside down. The next step would be to install the fans underneath the case.
Day 2 of building the PC. I know it usually takes, regular people a couple of hours maybe to build the whole thing, but because it's me, obviously I'm always going to make some mistake or maybe even just forget some stuff. In this case, I actually ran out of time. Sangran, who is helping me build this PC, is in Spain, and so the time difference is kind of challenging, and also the fact that I lost a couple of screws. So I had to order some through Amazon, and luckily they are now here. So we are going to continue the build. I actually moved down to downstairs and have a proper setup for building this this PC. It's just easier for me, and you will see that I am using this black mat so that's easier to see. It's a lot cleaner, definitely a bigger table, and I will be chatting with Daily Setup Tech or Sangran through here.
At this point, I now have 2 of the fans installed at the bottom of the case. Now I have to figure out how I can install the motherboard within the case itself. Luckily, Sangran was there because I didn't know that I have to first remove this bracket behind the motherboard so that I can install a different plate that will be compatible with the cooler that we are using for this build. I have to admit, as a first-time PC builder, I was very much overwhelmed with all the parts that were presented to me just by opening the box, so you have to read the instructions. And having a friend who knows what he's doing does help. So now all I have to do is secure the motherboard using these 4 points. But before I can do that, I would have to first remove this bracket where the power supply is going to be mounted on. It'll give me enough room to easily install the motherboard. This is actually also the perfect time for me to give a shout out to the sponsor of this video, which is Fanttik. They sent me this very compact and ergonomically designed electric screwdriver called the NEX L1 Pro. It has 6 different torque settings and features a stepless speed change using the trigger. That basically means the experience is completely smooth, snappy, and responsive. Once the bracket for the power supply was off, I was able to easily install the motherboard. Next is I had to attach this ribbon cable directly to the motherboard, and it was a little bit difficult because I had to really pull on it, but I managed to get it on there. Next is to install the cooler, but first I have to install this radiator on top of the PC, which means I have to remove the top part of the case. After installing the 2 fans on the radiator itself, I was ready to mount it on the case. After putting everything together, I had to now start figuring out where the cables go because it's kind of messy in here. The power supply is now mounted onto the bracket that I removed earlier, and oh my god, these cables were driving me crazy. So now I had to first test it and make sure that everything fits and figure out how I'm going to try to organize these cables as best as I could. Also, I first had to remove the bracket that the cooler came with and replace it with something that's compatible with the motherboard. The bracket was also provided with the cooler itself, and like I mentioned earlier, you have to read the instructions to make sure that you're using the correct one. So this is as far as I've gotten in my PC build so far, and the reason being is that I'm basically missing my GPU, which is going on this side, because I didn't know how popular the new one was going to be. And people are kind of crazy. But anyway, I also realized how messy this thing looks. It basically looks like roadkill at this point, but I'll work on that as I finish the build, and hopefully I can do that fairly soon. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned, and please try not to make too much fun of my PC.
I'm gonna have to call my friend and find out, exactly where I